Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology Virtual Salon. Today, we are going to be hearing about affinity space ethnography, exploring qualitative methods for studying online spaces. This is a topic that has been of interest to many of us for a long time, complex and important, and maybe never more so than now when so much of our social lives have shifted into online spaces. So I'm really, really grateful to be able to bring the team that we have today to present on this. My name's Elizabeth Fine. I've been organizing this season of virtual salons for SQIP. And this presentation will wrap up the 2020-2021 season. After this, our salons will be taking a break, and then we're going to kick off the next season on June 26th with our virtual conference. SQIP is doing a virtual conference this year. That's going to be on June 26th. And then there will be another series of virtual salons after that. So the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, for those of you who are new to us, is a division of the American Psychological Association's Division 5, a section of Division 5. Division 5 is a division of qualitative and quantitative methods, and we are the section that is dedicated to promoting qualitative research in psychology. So if you like what you see here, I encourage you to check us out at squip.org. And find out more about what we do and about how to join the organization. So welcome to Crowdcast. I'm going to give you a little introduction to the Crowdcast platform, just so you can learn your way around. So there are two ways for you as the audience to communicate with us and with each other. As you've seen, there's a chat on the side and where it says, say something nice. So that is just a freewheeling chat space. So feel free to say hello, introduce yourself, greet each other, share reactions to the presentations as they unfold, anything that crosses your mind, keep the conversation going in that chat window. If you have questions for our presenters, there's going to be a little Q&A at the end of the event. And so the place to put those questions is along the bottom. You'll see a little tab that says Ask a Question. So click on that, put your question in that space, and that's how we'll know to address it at the end of the event. The presenters won't be taking questions during their presentations. There's going to be a big group discussion at the end. So we've got a great group here today. We're going to hear first from Jane Lammers with Navigating Critical Junctures in the Design and Conduct of Affinity Space Research. We're going to hear from Alicia Magnifico with The Contradictions of Multi-Sided Context, Analyzing an Online Creative Writing Space. Then we're going to hear from Jen Scott Kerwood with A Poet's Craft, Tracing Youth Poetry from Slams to Social Media Spaces. Then we're very glad to have with us as discussant Dr. Ashley Maynard, who is going to give some remarks and responses to the presentation. Before we get into the individual presentations, though, I'm going to invite all of the presenters up to the stage, and they are going to give an introduction titled New Literacy Practices and Online Affinity Spaces, Implications for Research. Before we get started with that, one last pointer. If you are having technical difficulties, if you're having trouble hearing or seeing, the first thing you should try to do is refresh your browser window. Sometimes that will help. But if not, if you're still having trouble, put a message in the chat window. I'll be monitoring the chat and I can help you get that sorted out. There's a little bit of a lag between what's in the chat and what you see on screen, so just be aware of that. But if you have any questions or anything comes up, feel free to put a message into the chat window. We're really glad you're all here from all around the world. Welcome, really excited to get us started. So sometimes transitions take a minute or two. I'm just gonna take a moment, bring all our speakers up to the stage, and then we'll get started.
All right, everyone. Elizabeth, am I supposed to be able to see the slides as well as see myself? Because right now I can only see me.
So I am right now just getting everybody invited up onto the stage, and then I'm going to get our slides started up.
Fantastic.
So putting these into
Well, maybe while you're doing that, we can introduce ourselves.
Sounds good.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's wonderful to see folks from all around the world. We are very excited to have been asked to present at the SQIP Virtual Salon. My name is Alicia Magnifico, and I am from the University of New Hampshire. I currently teach in an English department. I teach our pre-service teachers who are going to become English teachers. And I have a PhD in educational psychology. So I do come at this from a psychological direction as well as an English teachery direction.
And I'm Jane Lammers from the University of Rochester, and I do not come at this from a psychological perspective, but purely an educational and literacy perspective.
And I'm Jen Scott Carwood from the University of Sydney in Australia. We're already at Friday morning here. At the University of Sydney, I am the English curriculum coordinator. I do have a background. One of my PhD minors is in educational psychology, and I've done some work in the learning sciences.
All right. So
I'm just going to pause for a second. Can you all see the slides okay now?
Yes.
Okay. And can you see me?
Yes.
I'd rather you not see me. Let me get rid of myself. Okay.
All right. So in this introductory part of our talk, I'm going to be starting this one off. We wanted to just give you a little bit of an introduction to what we mean by affinity spaces and a little bit of the history both of that term and of our research, which we've been doing together for almost a little bit more than a decade at this point. So Elizabeth, if you could give me the next slide, that would be great. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term affinity spaces, it was one that was coined by James Paul Gee in 2004. He is an educational linguist who is one of the first people to start looking at broad online communities, largely of people who were playing online games together. And specifically, this term was meant to denote informal spaces. They can be physical spaces, face-to-face spaces sometimes, virtual spaces, or blended face-to-face and virtual spaces, but specifically ones of informal learning where people are coming together on their own to interact around some kind of common interest or activity. Next slide. And importantly, what we see in affinity spaces is that these aren't like classes. There's not just one path through them. Instead, they offer multiple interest-driven trajectories and opportunities to learn together. And what that means practically is that some people in the space might be doing all kinds of different things. Some of them might be identifying problems or working on writing together. Some of them might be maintaining or building websites for folks to share their work. Some of them might be primarily on social media, sharing out some of the work that comes out of the space. Next slide, please. And as educators, one of the things that we're especially interested in these spaces is what are people doing and how is that affecting their learning and their developmental trajectories? Next slide. So some of the larger questions that we tend to ask around this research is what this means for people's learning. What does this mean for their cognitive development? What does this mean for various elements of developing literacies? And how do people come together in these various spaces? Next slide. And so one of the first things that we did in our own research was to map that out, to expand Jim Gee's initial characterization and to look at several features of online affinity spaces. So there are 9 of them. The first is this idea that a common endeavor is primary, that people are working together towards some common goal. The second one is that participation is self-directed. The third one is that portals, which are ways of entering an affinity space, it might be something like a Facebook group or a media site or Twitter hashtag. These are often multimodal. The fourth one is that affinity spaces provide a passionate public audience for content that members produce. The fifth one is that it's not just about formal learning, it's also about socialization and participation. Next slide, please. The sixth one is that leadership roles often vary within and among portals. The seventh one is that knowledge tends to be distributed across the whole space. The eighth one is a focus on cataloging and documenting content and practices within the space. And the ninth one is that these spaces often encompass a wide variety of media-specific and social networking portals. Everything from media fan sites, again, to things like Twitter hashtags. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jen, and we're going to talk a little bit about the culture of these spaces.
Thank you, Alicia. We have the next slide, please. So we found that because so much had changed with affinity spaces since Jim G coined the term in 2004, we had to go and think about how the tools and spaces were really changing. And so we asked ourselves as researchers, how can we gain insight into the culture of online affinity spaces? So we drew from a really rich body of work in ethnography. Next. To think about online ethnography, there's been quite a lot of work done there to then conceptualize. Next. Affinity space ethnography. So some of the work that we've done over the past decade has been to think through, what does affinity space ethnography mean? What does it look like? What are some of the challenges, and also where are the opportunities? Because especially with online research, and Alicia and I have a book with Sage as well, conducting qualitative research in online spaces. We're thinking, what are these spaces involve? And then how do people move across between not just the online spaces, but also the blended and the physical spaces as well? Next. So some of the different approaches that we've used in our own research, both collectively and individually, we've often begun with systemic observation to gain insight into the communication and semantic production in various portals. Next. The three of us have really we've actively worked to create relationships with our participants, and often these have spanned over a number of years and across a variety of different spaces. So we've conducted different interviews via Skype, Zoom, email, instant messenger, sometimes through the communication channels allowed within the different online portals as well, to gain insight into the key practices, beliefs, and values within the affinity space. Because I think that you can look at the affinity space like on the surface, and that can tell you a lot about how people are communicating, but it's not until you talk to the participants and you gain insight into what's happening behind the scenes. For instance, with some of the creative writing that we've looked at, if you look on like fanfiction.net, you can see quite a lot of the writing and the reviewing happening there, but you're not able to see kind of the beta feedback that people are getting unless you build these relationships and conduct these interviews with participants. Next. Thank you. And because affinity spaces are socially constructed, we've closely looked at artifacts. And so for us, this has involved collecting, cataloging, analyzing a lot of different artifacts, both those of which are publicly available on the space, but also ones that our participants have shared with us, such as their drafts of their writing. So we might only see the final one online, but through building these relationships, we can then see how that was built over time. Next.
So as we think about and have thought about in the last decade what it means to keep moving this research forward, we often come to it from a perspective of literacy. And so we're looking at the ways that various portals, especially as they change over time. Instagram was not nearly as popular, and it continues to shift over time as we've continued to study, and it gets used in different ways. And then you can see, because we can get into a whole discussion about conglomerates and buying up all of the smaller portals and how it kind of changes participation across all of them. But how are they each kind of privileging or recruiting different literacies, and how do they get reinforced across? Next. We also keep asking what the participants describe as the impact from a variety of perspectives: cognitive, social, and cultural, their developmental impact of their participation. It's the so what to them. Why does it matter to them? And then when we learn from these participants in these affinity spaces, what does that suggest about the next phase of research that we should be conducting? And last, I'm sorry, not last, second to last, beyond self-reports. We've started to think about how do we use metadata, how do we use background information, how do we use other methods of tracing to capture and understand the new literacy practices that get used beyond what our participants tell us. And now last, we're always asking, so what does this mean needs to happen and change with affinity space ethnography? And that concludes the introduction. And now we get to do deep dives into individual examples from each of us. And I have the privilege of going first, which is super fun to see myself stay on stage. I'm not used to being on the stage alone without my buddies as we talk about affinity spaces. So the presentation that Elizabeth is pulling up for me now is based on a chapter that I wrote from my dissertation. So first thing to tell everybody as she gets this title slide up for us is I am happy to share a PDF of that chapter with anyone who is interested, and you can get me at either Twitter or email and request that. So the goal of the book was to peel back the curtain and show kind of the warts and all. That was the charge that authors were given to write about what happens in research in these online spaces. And I took our affinity space framework and I took the dissertation work that I had done of an affinity space. And I also used Alan Peshkin's piece that I had used in a research methods class that I taught, where he did this kind of retrospective and looked back on a study that he did. And from there, I was able to articulate some of the messiness of research. Next. Because no matter what we say we design over there on the left, and it always ends up looking super neat in final publications, it's really stupid messy, right? It looks much more like what's on the right. And next, when you do online research, the mess actually looks like this, right? The mess isn't necessarily what was all over my desk. The mess was what was in my file system and the way that I needed to kind of structure that. Thanks so much, Avi, for putting up my email address. Yes, please hit me up for that chapter. Go ahead, next. So I coined this term critical junctures in this chapter, where I was thinking about the crucial points where we make decisions, and those decisions are made based on the convergence of our theoretical, contextual, and methodological factors. And once made, they kind of propel a study down a particular path. Next. And I want to share with you some critical junctures about the start of a study. So I'm not even talking about what it means to what you do when you have your data. I'm just going up to the practice of getting data in this one. And I'm going to run through these very quickly in my allotted time, knowing full well that you can ask questions that I'm happy to offer more information about. And again, you can look at the richer detail in the chapter. But the first juncture, go ahead, is this: what do you do? How do you start? Right? And you take this spark of an idea. The idea could come from all kinds of things. Maybe it was a call for an RFP for a grant. Maybe it was something you heard in a class. Maybe it was something you read. maybe it's something you do in your own practice that you came across. But it's also shaped by your epistemological approach. And then you also need to look at your doability. The one that I'm describing here, the affinity space study I'm describing, was part of a dissertation. So you can imagine there's all those I got to get done kind of doabilities. And the external constraints of the school that I was at, Arizona State University, and the expectations of my committee, one of whom was James Paul G. that Alicia mentioned in the introduction, who kind of initiated this affinity space theory. Next. My spark of my idea came from what I had been reading and understanding about adolescence and the amount of time they were spending online and all of the research that called for how we needed to theorize what was happening in those spaces. But most importantly, the last part that kind of spurred this was something I heard Jim say at a conference where he said, if you miss the community, you miss half the learning. And that led me, to, as I was understanding what writers were doing with The Sims, and I was thinking about the fiction that they were writing, what I came to understand as Sims fan fiction, where they were both fans of the game that they were using, but also fans of other media like Twilight or Harry Potter, that they were engaging in this literacy practice of producing these hybrid texts. And this is old school. For any of you who have played The Sims, this was Sims 2 way back when. Back before it was, online and multiplayered. But they were creating these stories. But keeping in mind that last point from the previous slide about what Jim said, I didn't study the practice in individuals. Next. I studied a community, right? And I went and kept looking. So I found a community and then reached this next critical juncture of needing to craft my research questions. And here again, my epistemology comes into play. I needed to gather some initial knowledge about my field site. I'm glad to see there's another Sims player in here. And then I was also paying attention to those literature conversations and things that were happening. So next slide. And I found this site. This was the community that I chose to study, which was the Sims Writers Hangout. It was a forum that was created and started by mostly young women who at the time were in high school or early college before they got too busy. And that was something that my participants told me. It was when they got too busy with life and other things that they stopped spending time here in this space. And they kind of, I had come to this study as a former English teacher who was always struggling with how to get my students to want to spend time on writing and revision and all of that kind of work and peer editing. And in this site, they were doing it. Next. And it looked like, a traditional forum where there were all kinds of things happening, and it was categorized in various ways by different topics, and I could see different things. There was also down at the bottom a bunch of chit chat, which in part led to what Jen and Alicia and I came to understand is the importance of the socializing that happens in these affinity spaces. Next. It was also where they talked about the actual stories and the Sims and the game and downloading custom content. And making your Sims look a particular way. But there was also this bookshop area where they posted their stories. Next. And they shared stories. They had a writer's lounge. They also ran contests. This HNTM season 4 that you see, they were fans of and borrowed the structure of the Hangouts Next Top model and ran a series of events that were based on Sims and had backstories, all this stuff. So I spent all of this initial time kind of studying this space and spending time there, which next led me to start brainstorming a bunch of possibilities in the of what to ask. And a lot of it was based on what I had been reading. I had been reading about this pro-am theory of professional amateurs. So you can see that appears in one of my questions in row 4. And I talk about in the chapter how, yes, I have these lovely, expansive questions, but they didn't start out that way. And so next, you see the questions that I ended up finalizing allowed, they kind of gave me some direction, but they also allowed for things to shift over time and still work well. You can see that I was interested in the collaborative learning that was happening. I was interested in, because probably I was coming from an education space where we're always trying to assess and monitor and what's happening, what's the caliber of something, how do you know you've done good work? So how does the space create those standards? What happens there? What does the participation in a particular space do to shape fan fiction? And then what's the nature of all of the different literacies? So beyond just the stories that they were creating, how do they craft their posts? What do they mean? What are hashtags a thing? At that time, no, but are they using emojis? What are they using? Next. And once I had those questions, that then dictated my design, right? So I had this affinity space ethnography. I also used some other virtual ethnographic research influences. But most importantly to me was this discourse-centered online ethnography, which really helped me focus something that informed this next critical juncture of who I wanted to talk to and how I would get to talk to them. So the third critical juncture, and I make this disclaimer in the chapter that it's not necessarily that all of this goes in a linear fashion, and you may not get to institutional review boards at this point. But when you do finally get there, there are ethical considerations, and then you have to work within your institutional constraints. So my go-to next for help with ethical guidance is AOIR. AIR, the Association of Internet Researchers, has done a lot of work on ethics over the years, and it continues to evolve. They've recently got their ethical guidelines 3.0. So I always direct people here first, and I think their guidance is helpful in asking questions. They don't give us a lot of answers. So if you're looking for answers about how do I consider something to be, whether it's public data or private, they won't give you the answer, but they will help you ask those questions, because this nature of publicness and privateness, if it's password protected, is it okay to just scrape data, or do I need to actually talk to the humans behind it? What do I do if humans talk to other humans and they're not part of my research? So lots of different questions to help you think about how to ethically design your studies. Next. And then what my institutional review board asked me to do is to do informed consent virtually and to offer this kind of website. We created a Google site and explained the study. My study was embedded within a larger project from one of our professors. And next. And it helped me, negotiating with them helped me navigate age-related constraints, because the idea of anybody can participate in an online space, but how do you get parental consent and informed consent? So I had to ask everybody for their birth date, not just if I couldn't ask if you are over 18 or not. They thought that that would incentivize people to lie and say that they were over 18. So everybody got asked their birthday, and then I had a phone call with one mom. Mom, I should put in air quotes. I think it was her mom, but she gave permission. So different ways to navigate, and I talk a little bit about that in the chapter. Next. And then I spent a lot of time swimming around, and here's where family and friends were asking me, like, are you really actually doing research, or are you just hanging out playing the game and spending time online? Because it was about a 6 to 8 month process of just understanding and navigating who I was going to be in the space. I was an outsider to the space. I intentionally decided I was never going to post publicly so that I wouldn't influence the space, recognizing that it was mostly younger women. So I didn't want to influence it with any kind of teachery voice. But I mapped the space, and I did what Michelle Noble describes as getting a feel for it. Next. Part of mapping the space is you've got to figure out what counts, right? So I had the Sims Writers Hangout, but you need to understand anything off of that. Does that count as being relative to your research? And that will change. And you only know that by spending time in the space. So for me, it did matter where they were posting pictures on Flickr, but then also how they would go to their own websites. And this is this is a bit of a map of one of my participants' spaces. She created her own website and YouTube channel, and did her own voiceovers, and her Sims work became then a different nature of multimodal and video. Next. And then the last critical juncture, as you're getting started, is then how do you gain insiders' perspectives? And recall that I described that Andrew Tsopoulos' discourse-centered online ethnography was really informative. He helped me see how to get those initial informants that pointed to who I wanted to talk to. G's theory about the variability of participation also helped me see that I needed to know what was happening. And once I had made those decisions early on, those prior decisions then pointed me to particular types of data collection. Next. So here were the 8 participants that I ended up talking to. And if you do a quick scan of how I've described them underneath their pseudonyms, you see that some of them were moderators, some of them were considered experts, but I also had a couple of newbies with Angela and Naomi. Angela started spending time in the space just after I started collecting my data, so I was able to kind of trace her participation. Oh my gosh, Karis, you're here with us. I just saw your chat. Nice to see you. And I also had people who never posted stories themselves. So Pamela was one of the moderators, never posted a story. Zara never posted a story, but they were influential to the space. Next slide. And here were the myriad ways that I collected my data, all informed by making those decisions. So I think that is my last slide. Just reminds you of, oh, sorry, one last thing. Crucial, you got to stay organized, right? So the filing system, if I took you on a tour of my filing system, whatever it means, however you do it, make sure that you keep everything. Keep everything, download everything, back up everything. I also have a horror story about when the site went dead and dark, and they stopped using it about a month before I defended my dissertation, and I nearly had a heart attack, but I had saved everything. So I think that brings me to my last slide. Just a reminder to get in touch with any questions after today.
Thank you very much. I just learned a lot. So I am going to now invite up to the stage Alicia Magnifico. Let me get Alicia. And she will be giving a presentation, The Contradictions of Multi-Sided Context, Analyzing an Online Creative Writing Space.
All right, friends. So while Elizabeth is getting the slides up, I also want to say that actually this talk, the one that I'm about to give, is also a chapter in the same book that that Jane was describing. I have a link to it at the very end. But again, I am totally happy to send you a copy of that if you're interested in seeing it. Elizabeth, that is not quite the beginning. If you could just go back up, that would be fantastic. Awesome. Yeah, so here we are. So Jane's talk kind of goes through the setup and the ways in which we motivate research studies. And mine's going to go in a slightly different direction. This one was actually one that followed up my dissertation. And one of the things that the three of us started talking about relatively early on is how we saw affinity spaces changing over time. So Jane's study looks primarily at one forum and the different kinds of artifacts that people posted to that forum. They were using tools like Flickr, but largely the conversation was right there. But as we started to write and talk together, we started to thinking about the ways in which affinity spaces were changing and getting bigger with the advent of social media. And so this study is about that. It's about this idea of following learners across and through the different online and offline sites that they learn from. So today, essentially, I'm going to tell you a story about how I started to study an online writing space called Figment, and how that study went in a very different direction than I thought it would, because the space existed over multiple sites. Next slide, please. So the front page of the Figment site looked like this. Unfortunately, this is another one that is no longer online. And I became interested in this space because it was focused on writing in a way that my first ethnographic study, which was focused on creative writers in the online game Neopets, didn't quite focus on writing in the same way. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to learn more what it meant to write within an interest-driven space that was devoted to writing, and how people participate in this space that was primarily designed for teenage writers and readers. Next slide. So we've already talked a little bit about some of the main features of affinity spaces, but here I want to note that they were originally theorized by Jim G before social media exploded, and that several of us, including the three of us, have been continuing to work with these theories as media landscapes have changed. Next slide. And this became relevant in looking at the affinity space surrounding Figment, because it really was a collection of related sites that supported creative writing and reading. And that collection, increasingly, as I spent time there, seems to be populated by several groups of writers who collaborated in different kinds of ways. Next slide. So what does it mean when I talk about writing and collaboration? So here in this brief lit review, you see that cooperative and collaborative writing help people see their work as meaningful. They provide audiences, they provide contexts where writing is valued. But in the literature on writing, we still, even today, see collaboration primarily as group work. But in online spaces and affinity spaces, they increasingly provide venues both for small groups, like things like fan fiction reviews or forums, as Jane just showed you, but also for massive collective actions like Twitter hashtag campaigns. Next slide. So in other words, spaces for online writing, they are shifting contexts. And while research often focuses on single sites, for instance, a fan fiction reader and her beta readers on fanfiction.net, many affinity spaces like Figment have moved to a multi-sited model. Next slide. And that can lead to questions and tensions as people are using the different tools of the space in different ways. Next slide. So in terms of what that looks like, the broader media ecology of Figment, I'm borrowing that media ecology term from Mimi Ito and her team, shows that there's not only Figment writing activity on Figment, but also on all of these associated sites and groups, from DeviantArt to Twitter to fanfiction.net. Next slide. Or as the Figment site used to put it, we're everywhere. Next slide again. And it was not just the provenance of fan sites. On Figment, it was a site that was started by publishers, and that seems to affect people's social media use as well. Next slide. So while I started with questions that honestly now feel a little bit naive about Figment writers' participation on Figment, I quickly ended up expanding these questions to examine the associated portals and how I needed to think across portals in the space. Next slide. So in my methods, I realized that I needed and wanted to get a sense of how Figment saw its own portals and functioned as an affinity space. So to do that, I engaged in observation and content analysis of the site's own design elements and public social media. And that meant starting off with examining the site blog, the Tumblr feed, and the Twitter feed. Next slide. So the first thing that I'm going to show you here is this idea of looking in at Figment's design elements and this close reading of the user interface and the posting and sharing features. Next slide. So two of these major elements were writer profiles and book profiles. Next slide. And Figment writer profiles look like a social network. So writing, personal information, site badges, wall chat, all of these things are given similar amounts of space. Next slide. And often, as you can see here from my profile, this was right at the beginning, so I didn't have any followers yet. But this social networking kind of content got top level billing. Next slide. And allowed Figment writers to create updated links to friends writing. But one of the interesting things was that those were used relatively rarely, potentially because not all teenage writers actually want to be writing in the presence of their real world friends and family. Next slide. And now what we're going to look at is the design element of the book profile. Next slide again. And book profiles really put the focus on the writing. So while the Figment writer profiles were much more about all of their activity, here is where you actually see the writings and the content that Figment users, who are known as Figs, publish. Next slide. And these here too, we see lots of social media tie-ins to Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook, and largely, again, those seem to be used relatively rarely. Next slide. Yeah, actually, sorry, I should have asked for that slide. Next slide again. And we also see many different ways that people can react and respond to writing, which suggests, again, that response by other Figment readers is also significantly valued by this site. Next slide. So again, we see many ways to react and respond to writing. And the book profiles really were one way in which writing was made very central. Next slide. So now we're going to look a little bit at Figment's social media profile, this idea of looking out at the sites that are affiliated with Figment and how they're linked together in an affinity space. Next slide. So first we're going to look at the Daily Fig, which was the site blog. And two of the most common kinds of posts on the Daily Fig were these links you'll like roundups of interesting literary content around the web. Next slide. And also various kinds of quizzes, things like what's your favorite movie made from a book? Who's your favorite character in X series? Next slide. And so here what you see is a table of my content analysis. And during the time of this analysis, the Daily Fig tagged such posts as odds and ends, and there were 9 of them. These were the most common items that were posted. And notably, that serves in contrast to the 1 post each about Figment writers and writing. That kind of content I saw appear much more rarely. Next slide. So overall, there's this idea that the Daily Fig included literary content across the categories. So many posts really required readers to have deep literary knowledge. But at the same time, there wasn't a whole lot there about writing or the roles of writers. Next slide. So now we're going to look at the Figment Tumblr feed, and they posted literary content about books and writing, like this illustrated book quote. Next slide. And also quite a bit of fandom content, like this Disney Doctor Who crossover. Again, next slide. But again, in the content analysis table, there was relatively little direct connection to Figment writers and writing. So we see 15 books in literary content, and 13 fandom and media, but only 1 post each that made direct connections to Figment. Next slide. So again, a lot of the Tumblr content was also literary, things like the Doctor Who crossover art or book quotations, but doesn't address writing. So it seemed almost like a different part of the space where Figment was making connections between young writers and the geekiness associated with fan fiction writers or fantasy and sci-fi fans. Next slide. And finally, we see some of this fandom-related content on Twitter, like this about Doctor Who. Next slide. But also a lot of contests for the publishers and authors who are the financial sponsors of Figment. Next slide. And you see, again, from the content analysis, the 2 most common kinds of things were conversations with other fans, which is not surprising given the format of Twitter. But the most common activity revolved around these sponsored contests. Next slide again. So overall, you see little explicit writing work, and instead you get a lot of conversations with fans, as well as marketing for Figment contests, which get many people to tweet about the publisher investors' books. So that seems like perhaps not a huge accident there. Next slide. So having thought about the various design elements of the broad Figment space, I want to return to this idea of Figment as an affinity space, and specifically one that is a collection of online sites that may be loosely organized around a main theme or activity. We see a lot of teen writing here, a lot of books, a lot of literary content, but not necessarily one that works to connect users across different portals. Next slide. So this is interesting because while the initial 9 features that we wrote and I told you about suggest that common endeavors are primary and that knowledge is very commonly shared across the affinity space, design analyses like this one suggest that maybe as affinity spaces have gotten larger and more complex, they begin to look less like single spaces or contexts for learning. Next slide. So we might begin, and in fact, the 3 of us did begin, with the idea that there's fairly equitable distribution and connection among these kinds of portals in an affinity space. Next slide. But you might find out over the course of your study that certain kinds of sites are much more dominant and maybe even less connected than that Figment we're everywhere umbrella might suggest. Next slide. And what's really interesting here, flipping back into the experience of users, is that because these different portals include different practices and cultures, I really started to wonder about Figment's practices and values across the affinity space too, and to wonder about whether or not there was connection across the massive collective, or whether this was one space. Next slide. So although I should also note here that doing this kind of design and user interface work does only provide one prong of understanding. This doesn't show users' potential subversion of these features or the way that they change over time. Next slide. But I think what's interesting to talk about here is that I went into this study with what I thought was a pretty good idea of what I expected from Figment as an affinity space. And I learned something that was really, really different. And that made me start asking bigger questions about affinity spaces and about this research. And our, you got this sense as a graduate student or as a postdoc, I was a postdoc when I was doing this work, that our methods texts tell us that qualitative and ethnographic research are always going to evolve as we engage. But it might be especially important to keep that in mind if you're beginning to examine spaces and communities like this right now, as so many things are continually changing about our mediascapes. So I'm going to end there for now. And the last slide here is a citation to this particular chapter. And I would love to hear what you think of that. And I'd love to talk more in the Q&A. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to pass it over to Jen.
Thank you. Now going to take a moment to welcome up to the stage Jen Scott Carwood. Jen, I can't hear you. Could you make sure your mic is up? There we go. I've got your mic. Try again. Say something.
Okay,
Great.
Is that working now? All right, let me see if I'm able to share my own slides here. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Lovely. Okay, so first I just wanted to say how instrumental this collaboration has been with Jane and Alicia over the years. So we all finished our PhDs about a decade ago, and we've known each other for years before that, and we all had the opportunity to work with Jim G, both at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and at Arizona State University. But this collaboration has just been amazing, not only in supporting our careers, but also advancing our understanding of concepts like affinity spaces. And so over the years, we've published 10 different chapters and articles together and given over 20 presentations in a number of different countries. So for the PhD students who are listening, I would really encourage you to find people that you can collaborate with over the long term, because it's something that will not only help your career, but that collaboration, that friendship is instrumental in so many ways. So right now I'm going to talk about the other part of affinity spaces, because again, they're conceptualized as online, offline, or blended spaces. And so I'll be drawing from some of my ongoing research on spoken word poetry, which kind of stems from my interest in poetry in general. So some of the first research that I did many years ago was looking at digital poetry in schools. About 5 years ago, we did some research on a poetry community within Figment.com, which relates to some of Alicia's research in that space. And we found that young adults really view their poetic literacy as something that's situated and collaborative, and they valued how the reciprocal nature of collaboration helped fuel their passion and their motivation. I've also done research looking at Insta poetry and how social media tools like Instagram are ways for young people and adults to share their poetry, right? Because originally Instagram was developed for sharing visual images, but it also is a phenomenal site for sharing poetry and being part of different poetry communities there through the use of hashtags and tags too. And so more recently, I've become interested in spoken word. If you've ever been to a poetry slam, it's amazing, right? Whether you're in the audience or on the stage, but the energy and the storytelling is something that I think draws people together. And there's something about human nature that wants to tell our stories and have our stories be heard. And so in 2015, I received a grant from UNESCO to do research on the Bankstown Poetry Slam. So Bankstown is located in Western Sydney. It's the largest poetry slam, not only in Australia, but we think also in the Southern Hemisphere. And every month they would have a poetry slam that gathered together about 200 to 300 people from the community, mostly young adults, but I mean, anywhere from 5 to 75 years old people would show up. And so with this work that I did on looking at spoken word, I was able to follow spoken word poets over a number of years in a number of different contexts, both online and offline. I think that that's something that's been really interesting for my understanding of spoken word and poetry in general as a researcher. So just to define spoken word, in case you don't have a background in it, prior research has shown that offers individuals this real-world, authentic audience for their creative work and really encourages them to see how identity and cultural politics are central to that. And so it's a way to share experiences that's not structured by rules that you might have in schools like an essay or something like that too. Often it's part of a competition, often it's timed, and it's not just about the words, it's about the performance and the poetic engagement of all of that too. So it brings together storytelling, encourages young people to cultivate literate identities, and also to develop a sense of belonging and purpose. So what I found really interesting is what it means for me as a qualitative researcher to conduct multi-sited ethnographic research on spoken word. And so I've got 3 different studies that I'm going to highlight here. and then think about what the key takeaways for me as a researcher, kind of looking back at my career, over the past 10 years plus as a researcher and 23 years as a teacher, then looking ahead as well. So the first study that really focused on the Bankstown Poetry Slam. So this is the community-based slam that drew together poets every month. And so with this, I interviewed audience members, conducted a number of focus groups with them, interviewed different poets, and also looked at the Bankstown Poetry Slam's social media spaces. So they're quite active on YouTube, Instagram, and they have their own website as well. And through talking with the different poets, I was able to gain a sense of what spoken word meant to them, how participating in this real world affinity space made a difference in terms of their literacy, their identity, but also their connectivity to other people within the community. The second study then looked at one of the initiatives of the Bankstown Poetry Slam. So the founders of Bankstown Poetry Slam are really passionate about outreach into the community. And so one of their initiatives is they work with students in schools in Western and Southwestern Sydney, which are very diverse areas of the city. And so over the course of 6 weeks, mentor poets are able to work with a small group of young people where they learn all about spoken word, they start to write, they start to perform. And in the study, the second one I'm talking about here, there's 14 different schools involved, and we did case studies of 2 of them, focus groups with the mentor poets, and all of this culminate. So here's a couple of the mentor poets here. So talking to the mentor poets, talking to the high school students, talking to their teachers, we're able to see what it meant to bring spoken word into a school-based setting in terms of their literacy, their identity, and how teachers and mentor poets could cultivate an affinity space within the classroom, more of a formal school context. At the end of the Real Talk workshops, there was performances where brought all the different young people together from the different schools, and it helped make their poetry, their identities, brought them onto stage for the first time. And this has led to our current study. So 2 of the young women who were involved in the Real Talk workshops 3 years ago, and the city did that as year 10 students, they've now since graduated from high school. And so we wanted to do some follow-up work with them to say, okay, how has taking part in these Real Talk workshops shaped you, right? By introducing you to poetry, by having you reflect on your identity and everything. So we've conducted some follow-up interviews and collected additional poems from them to really have like a longitudinal view to understand how participation in this affinity space has shaped who they are, what they do, and how they interact with the world, particularly as they're coming of age, in a time of global crisis. So these are the 2 young women. They went to different high schools, but they were paired together for some of the Real Talk workshops. And one has a background as a Pacific Islander, one has a background as Indian, and they thought about how their identities as women of color, young women of color, were really being shaped by the world around them. So they perform poems together, and they've become very fast friends. And so what I wanted to do is to think a little bit now about qualitative research and what it means for us as researchers going into these different spaces. And I feel like I've been very lucky and very honored to be invited into these different spaces. And so building on some of the insights that Alicia and Jane have already shared about going to the spaces, I wanted to think about what it meant for more like the physical real world spaces as well. And the first thing that I came to is just how critical it is to build relationships. If I hadn't cultivated relationships with the Poetry Slam founders, with the poets themselves, and done all that within the community initially, I wouldn't have been able to do the second or the third study, right? I was only able to do that because I showed interest, I showed involvement, I showed respect, and I showed participation as well, which in a lot of ways for me as a researcher took me out of my comfort zone. And spoken word poetry at its core, it's all like speaking the truth and being honest about one's experiences and doing so in a way that shows responsibility to yourself and to the community. And so one of the things I realized early on when I was doing this research, when I started back in 2016, was if I'm asking poets to talk to me about their life, about their poems, about everything that they do, and to share themselves and be vulnerable in that way, I felt like it was only fair for me to do so in some ways as well, and to even get on stage. And so I have to say, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I feel pretty comfortable in front of a classroom. I've given heaps of talks, but getting on stage to perform a 3-minute spoken word poem in front of 300 people about a topic that's very dear to me, is about becoming a mother, was absolutely terrifying. But I think that I learned so much through that process. And I think that, well, it's not like immortalized forever on YouTube. I think it also helped gain respect from the people who I was asking to take part in my research. And I think it showed that kind of reciprocity and that respect and that mutuality that is really critical in ethnographic research. I would also really encourage you all to look for opportunities for longitudinal study. I remember being a PhD student and hearing Jim G talk about Kathy Kempton-Lilly's research, and she's more in early childhood education. And he's like, look, it's brilliant. By the time you're like publishing your research, you're like 5 to 10 years in. So for anyone to catch up with you, it's going to take them like another decade. And so something that I think has been really beautiful about this work that I've done with spoken word is because I've cultivated these relationships, because I've become part of the community, I've had these opportunities to do longitudinal study and to follow up with poets years later to see what it's actually meant. And I think that that's something that is really significant with qualitative research and unique about it. And we need to look for the opportunities to do so. This is just a sample from a poem from one of the young women. So it's Jamini and Miracle that we're following up with now. So again, they've just graduated from high school. They're coming of age during a pandemic, and we're able to talk with them, and we use their own poetry as stimuli within our interviews to help understand what poetry means to them. And especially now, in Australia, we've been pretty lucky. So we were able to start having the slams again, even though they went online for most of last year. But when that happened, due to the pandemic, what that meant for them as poets and just as young women. And something that I've become really passionate about is being creative with analyzing and disseminating data, because I think when you begin as a researcher, you want like a manual. You want someone to tell you exactly how to do, what to do it, and like be able to follow that and know that your data and your findings are then trustworthy and reliable. But it doesn't exist. And so something that I found really helpful was to think about how unsettling it is for me as a researcher to be, I have all that data, and Jane shared her screenshot with just how much data you often collect as part of these studies, and just to kind of sit with those moments of disequilibrium and to think about, okay, what can I do with this? And so as a researcher, I've even turned to poetry. And so since I was part of this community where we're looking at Insta poetry and for one study, and then I was looking at the Bankstown Poetry Slam and the social media presence for another, even using poetry as a way to start thinking through my data, start thinking through what it means for me, and writing poetry and sharing poetry has been part of my data analysis process. I've also, look, I'm 10 years out from my PhD, and I've published things like over 50 like chapters and articles, and have like the H-index and all those metrics. But as a researcher, I don't want what I've offered to the world or to my field to be reduced to a number. And whilst it's important to, be successful in your career as your university defines it, I don't just want to write for academic audiences and other people who are also in ivory towers. And so that's why I'm looking for opportunities like performing spoken word, writing poetry and sharing it online. Or this is actually a 10-minute short documentary that I produced. It's currently under review with a couple of film festivals about the Bankstown Poetry Slam. So I would really encourage you to think about how you can be creative and how you analyze your data, but also how you share it. How can you put it out to public audience? How can you make sure that people beyond just academics or even teachers are getting access to your work, right? So it's really making an impact more broadly. And so that's all that I have for today. Any of the articles I've cited here are available on my website, jenscottcurwood.com as well. And please get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you. I'm turning it back over. There you go.
Thank you so much. So I'm now going to just take a minute and invite all of our panelists up to the stage, as well as our discussant, Ashley Maynard. And while Ashley is sharing her remarks, I also want to encourage all of you to put any questions that you have for our speakers today into that place where it says ask a question. There'll be some time for them to respond as well.
Hello.
Great. Looks like we're all here.
Yay.
All right. Well, welcome first off to Dr. Ashley Maynard, and I'm hoping you could take a couple of minutes and just share any remarks or responses you had to our presenters, and maybe kind of get us started off into a discussion. And then I'll be reading questions from the chat as they come in once we get into our Q&A.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you for having me. I am Ashley Maynard. I'm a cultural developmental psychologist with postdoctoral training in psychological anthropology. And I've conducted ethnographic research with a group of Highland Maya in Chiapas, Mexico for 26 years. So I just loved hearing about this new area of ethnography, which is so important today and which a lot of people are trying to figure out, including my own students, by the way. So, some key takeaways from the session overall and from each paper, and then some questions maybe at the end. I'll try to go quickly so there's a lot of time for discussion. As I said, I think this ethnography of affinity spaces is absolutely essential science. And these talks give us an excellent glimpse into how to think about this kind of research and how to get started. People, including youth, are spending so much time in online spaces. We need to understand how those spaces function, especially the spaces that work well. These researchers today have taken us into spaces that seem to be functioning very well. I would add, I think we also need to look at spaces where things are breaking down. So we saw key features of ethnography here that are shared with any kind of ethnography, including especially very first observation and often participant observation. So I loved seeing that. Multiple interviews, including taking advantage of different kinds of modalities to do those interviews, the collection of artifacts and what they mean to people, even using those probably sometimes to cue the interviews. And from Jane's presentation, we saw we can take 6 to 8 months to adapt to a community. And that's the same in a face-to-face ethnography. It often takes you 6 to 8 months to get people to trust you and to start to figure out what's going on and the questions that you want to ask. From Jen's presentation, we're reminded that building relationships is absolutely key to ethnographic research, and also that engaging in longitudinal studies is worthwhile. You will learn so much and develop as you go along. I absolutely loved hearing from Jane about the critical junctures and the acknowledgement of the messiness of research. As a psychologist, I will say that generally in psych journals, we don't get to see the things that failed, the messiness. Even in a lot of ethnographic work, we don't hear about what it was like to hang out and make faux pas and ask the wrong questions and all of the mess. So I really want to read more about the mess, and I am eager to check out this book that you folks mentioned. And so I really saw, these critical junctures help us make sense by pulling information from the stream of ongoing life and information that's in the world through these organizing lenses, right? I mean, these papers show so well, ethnography is question-driven. It expects us to acknowledge and state our epistemologies and move ahead. And this kind of work is so critical to psychology. So I'm really glad that the APA is behind this and that this group is promoting this kind of work. For Alicia, in multi-sided ethnography, I mean, just imagine, so you're going from one online space to these different kinds of online spaces. Then with the question of the sponsorship there, I think it's important for us to remember that. But to see how the ethnography of distributed learning and activity of affinity spaces points to distributed cognition and collaborative learning. And I thought, we need to know a lot more about that. So this raises questions. And I loved the acknowledgement that I think so many of us share, that our early naive questions developed as we engaged in the field. They develop into informed questions through the ethnographic experience, which is so essential. And so there are these useful findings and things to think about for expanding the kinds of learning spaces that we engage youth in. You know, some of our youth are bored and checking out of the traditional classroom, teacher in front of the room, the typical essay structure. And these kinds of spaces in Alicia's paper and Jen's, you know, let us know, hey, actual real learning is going on. And guess what? You can make them learn and work and write, and it doesn't feel like learning, working, or writing. I like that. I know that would reach so many students. And of course, some anonymity while developing writing skills could be helpful for students who feel shy, even adults who feel shy or who have very deeply personal things that they could open up and write about, but might not feel comfortable doing, submitting to their literary magazine at school if there is one, or to their English teacher, and they don't want their parents to even know. So this provides a lot of outlets psychologically as well that are going to be so useful. Adding social media, I'm so glad that you brought this in. It's so complicated to think about how to even get started. I would not have known where to start. And so now I think, okay, I can point my students to this work, and I'm so excited to become acquainted with it. Those 9 features are really great that you presented in your introduction, so I'll keep drawing people's attention to that. And then Jen's examination of slam poetry. You know, we have this, as you said, a way to share experiences, not structured by rules or an essay structure. And I saw, oh, this domain of literacy development not only promotes the use of language and the development of art, but specifically develops, as you said, abilities in storytelling, the development of a literate identity and sense of belonging and purpose. You know, there are so many indigenous traditions of storytelling around the world that we could acknowledge and bring out, you know, even in your standard face-to-face English class. And so maybe this kind of awareness will bring that into those classrooms as well. And Jen points out to us how critical it is to build relationships and sometimes to get out of our comfort zones. You know, but it seems with traditional training in psychology, at least 30 years ago, we were expected to design an experiment and do research a certain way that would keep ourselves out of it. And I'm not sure that that's ever true. You know, when people say research is me searching, and you can really see it. It's so many people's Rorschachs, right? But just laying that out there and acknowledging it, I think it does provide this sense of wonder and beauty. And when you acknowledge that you have some kind of personal stake and comfort zone and curiosity about it, that's when you can actually examine it and be objective about it when you put it out there instead of just trying to hide it. So I was really enthused about that. And of course, our own moments of disequilibrium. I mean, so acknowledging that we face these moments and we've got to just calm down and deal with them and deal with the mess of research is very, very important. So you've all laid down this very useful path, actually several paths that a lot of people can follow. This is just so incredibly helpful. I was also thinking, you know, general longstanding questions. How do newcomers become old timers? Right? How do people who join these groups? I'm thinking of Lev and Wanger especially, and others. You know, and then how does this differ in an internationally distributed online space compared to in-person spaces? So this is going to tell us more about how humans affiliate and develop belongingness, which are essential to human development. And, you know, can we do this entirely in an online space? And how does it compare, you know, phenomenologically and in people's bodies and spirits the way to the way we do it in person? Because we may be needing to do more of it online. Then, how does knowledge production happen in this distributed fashion? So I could say more about that, but I want to be faster. I was also thinking about distributed cognition in the wild, a la Ed Hutchins and others. This is so compelling. Again, you know, we see things happening in the explicit statements left by participants. So this is really cool. So one aspect here is that we're not imagining what's in their heads, although I think you can make some inferences as well, and I'm sure you have, because humans are not robots, right? So even if we're distributed, even if we're creating something together online or in this online space, They're still going to be implicit happenings as well as these explicit happenings. So your interviews can provide great insights to that. And, lastly, we learn about studying, as you said, learning and the social and cognitive development of youth as they develop literacies in digital participation and production. And this is all so uplifting, and you can tell I'm very excited. But I was also left wondering, I think it's essential that we try to understand affinity spaces that are peddling in conspiracy theories or lies, and then how are we going to undo that learning, such as it is, that is happening? Because people they think they are learning and they're developing views of the world that we have seen are actually harmful. And so you have presented helpful spaces, and you've shined a light on spaces that are sharing light and bringing more light. But at the same time, we know that the internet is a place where people can hide in the dark and spew untruth and flat out lies and conspiracies that have brought darkness and harm. And so I want to challenge people who are curious to start to explore that learning, and then very critically how to undo it as we move forward together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you. Oh, are we a little echoey? Okay. So I want to invite now all of our speakers to respond to Ashley's comments, whatever thoughts or things that you want to share in response. And since we've had one question come in that hasn't been answered yet, I just want to throw it in the hopper. This is from, you've responded to it a bit in the Q&A, Jen, but this is from Fred Wirtz, who wants to understand more about procedures of analysis, how new insights were achieved, including the problem of generality, in as much as that is a goal of knowledge, and the role of theory, if that is relevant. So throw that in there as well, and then turn it over to the group.
I think I'll just begin by saying that one of our frustrations as we were like PhD students was how little we could find about the details of methodology. And we really wanted to see that. And we felt like often the data collection, the data analysis sections were short or perfunctory and not at all helpful for what we really needed. And so part of the work that we've done together over the years has been to both develop methods, but then explicitly articulate them. So I popped the link to one of those. It's a PDF, so you have the directly. But we've really tried to explicate our methods and then how that relates to our theory and all that too. And we've also written about the ethical implications, and that's something that Jane talked about briefly in her presentation. At my university, so we call them Humanities Research Ethics Committees in Australia. And so I was on our Humanities Ethics Committee for 8 years and served as chair for 4. And so I've read and offered feedback and written heaps of ethics applications. And so I think that both the methodology and also the ethical advocacy that sometimes we have to do as qualitative researchers to say, no, the approach we want to take to data collection or to data analysis, or the participants we're striving to include, there are ethical ways to do so. And the Association of Internet Researcher Guidelines can be really helpful in that regard. So Alicia and Jane, is there anything you want to add?
Go ahead.
On that, I don't actually feel like I have a lot to add. I mean, I would say in terms of ethics, I think it's useful for the entire audience to get to know your ethics committee or your IRB committee, because
serve on them.
Yes, and better yet, serve on them, because we see this wide swath of ways that people use internet research. I literally reviewed a paper 2 weeks ago that included big quotations from an online forum, and I wrote back. I was like, look, it took me 5 minutes to figure out what this forum was, and I understand that you're not naming people's names, but this is still an issue. Like, because it's out there as an online archive doesn't necessarily mean that you should just use that information. And yeah, so we've definitely done a lot of thinking over the years about ways of approaching those situations, ways of blinding research where we are using public data, ways of, part of the reason that I presented the public Figment social media to you today was that I felt like I really wanted, with that particular study, to start there, because that really was genuinely public data and public information, and analyzing it shows us a whole different side of a space, which then informs the work with participants pretty significantly.
And I'll take us in another direction with one of Ashley's threads, where she talked about the importance of seeing the faux pas that we do. And I would love to see some of us launch the Journal of Mess Ups. The Journal of Research Mess Ups could be a great journal, right? And here's where guidance from Yanis Andritsopoulos kind of was a helpful, like, oh, duh, I should have done that. It was my institutional review board gave me the procedure of collect information, collect an email, collect a birth date from this Google site, and contact them through email, right? If you know anything about teenagers, you know that maybe email is not the best place to contact them, right? So I would make contact in a private message or a PM, it was called there, DMs, whatever, in the Sims Writers Hangout, and then direct them to the Google site, and I'd follow up with email. And then I'd sit there patiently waiting, going, all right, is anyone going to respond to me? Is anyone going to respond to me? No, they're not going to respond to me. And when I finally went back to the site and followed up, especially this came to be with Pamela, the moderator, she was like, I don't even remember the password of that email address that I gave you. Like, I have no idea how to get into it. But yeah, I'd love to do an interview with you. And so then I needed to chop up my interview and do it through DMs. And Andritsopoulos told me, had I paid attention to it, that you contact informants where they are. Like, you use the systems of the space rather than imposing this external system of email on the communication, right?
Although
So,
that's sometimes challenging when you have an IRB that really wants you to do it another way.
right.
Yeah.
It's very true. And
Yeah.
I assuaged myself by saying they just told me I had to collect the email address and birth date. They didn't say I had to have all my communications through email.
Wait, so why was that a faux pas, Jane?
Well, because I said how long I waited for her to respond by email.
I see.
Like, it was all over the whole winter break, and I was like, I need to start collecting data. Like, and I knew that winter break was going to be a great time to reach a teenager. She was in like multiple AP classes in her senior year in high school in Canada. Like, she didn't have time for me except for on break. But I wasted nearly the whole winter break waiting for her to respond to my email.
So I just noticed we've got another question about how do we think the COVID pandemic may have influenced the nature and range of affinity spaces, and what are the research implications? Which I think is a really great question. And I think, first of all, we've seen a lot of researchers not be able to do what they had planned. You know, while in Australia we haven't, been affected in the same way as many other countries. A lot of my honors students and PhD students, they had a window that they were going to collect data in schools, and the schools were closed then. And so I think a lot of researchers have had to re-envision what their data collection is going to look like, reimagine their studies, but it's also created new opportunities for research. So one of my honor students, we looked at how English teacher education programs in Australia had to pivot and move online, and how they responded during the pandemic. So we've already got that chapter in press. So I think we've actually got a lot of publications and edited collections related to the pandemic in particular that are coming out, which I think is really interesting. Alicia and Jane, other thoughts on how the pandemic shaped all of this?
I think one of the really interesting things, I actually have another research project that is deliberately studying teachers' responses to the pandemic. And one of the things that we're seeing in that project is the ways in which some teachers are bringing in techniques from affinity spaces into their classrooms. So for instance, I just gave a presentation on collaborative annotation in the classroom, and the ways in which you can work together essentially through comments to together annotate an article or annotate a piece of student writing. And that's not something that we've necessarily seen in classrooms before. So there's some interesting convergence in practices among formal spaces and informal spaces that I think is absolutely worth further study.
And I'll say from another one of my projects, I was in Indonesia on a Fulbright grant prior to the pandemic. And I was studying the digital literacy practices of secondary students in Central Java. And all the while also giving talks at universities about literacies and about fan-based practices. And I would spend the first, 20 minutes of an hour-long talk explaining and justifying why these teachers, both at the tertiary level and at secondary level, needed to pay attention to the digital. And for them, that was a new concept. Well, I recently gave another talk in Indonesia virtually to a similar type of audience and got to delete the first 20 slides of my presentation because after COVID, there's no need to justify the pay attention to the digital, right? Because everybody had to pay attention to the digital for a year and everybody had to think through implications and everybody got to experience in some ways. And I made this comment in the chat. People thought you could just translate ethnography into the online without thinking about what online ethnography meant, what affinity space ethnography meant. And I think as people took the disruption and tried to pivot, they then scrambled in some ways. Another point that I want to bring back around from something you ended with, Ashley, about those kind of less than light spaces and what's happening in them. And we unfortunately keep getting example after example after example of why we need to pay attention to these darker spaces. And I had one of my students who was an addictions counselor study the dark web and study opioid sourcing in the dark web. And that's my only kind of from the sidelines experience into a darker space that isn't as collaborative and helpful as the kinds of spaces that we've described. And what he found is there's a lot of research happening in some of these scarier, darker, more white supremacist spaces in AIR, in the Association of Internet Research. So they are again doing a virtual conference in October. They did it last year, and all you needed to do was be a member. They didn't charge an additional fee, so that it's really an easily accessible space, organization. So I highly recommend, if you're thinking of doing this kind of work, connecting with that organization. There are people from a variety of different fields, but who are in that kind of methodology that kind of come together and have a lot of really rich conversations. I blessedly got to ignore most of those deep, dark, creepy spaces, but there are people who did that work there.
So I know that we are close to the end of our time. I did want to just boost one aspect of Fred Wertz's question that I wanted to hear about, which is, there's such an incredible rich specificity about these sites that you study. You know, so much particularity about how they're put together and what's going on. And at the same time, you're getting at questions that are bigger about how people learn and what people learn and what collaboration does for learning and what the structure of spaces do for how learning works and what people learn. And so how in your analysis process do you do that? And how does theory help you, or what theories have helped you in building some of those bridges?
We do a lot of pattern recognition, right? Like just in any kind of qualitative research, and a focus on the practices rather than the particulars, I think has helped us.
I also think too, we've done, one of the things that has helped us get at the bigger questions is the fact that we've literally been working together for 10 years. And we started from a place where each of us was doing different kinds of ethnographic work. And we actually had a discussant in an early conference, basically like literally in the discussion, look at us and say, why aren't you writing together? You need to be writing together. And we did. And we took that seriously, but in many ways, it's been a process of coming together and doing the pattern recognition at a larger level, because we've been able to do this work across a series of studies. One of the interesting theoretical insights, to pick up again on something that Ashley said, you were thinking about this idea of moving from novice to expert, and one of the things that we didn't realize for about 6 years, friends, was that we had made exactly that kind of assumption, which is a very classroom-based assumption about what affinity spaces do, that people really did come in from wherever they came from and wanted to become central participants. If you were a fan fiction commenter, you were eventually going to become a fan fiction writer. And we had this very kind of Levin-Wengery, teachery assumption about the ways that things work. And we have more recently been working on rejecting that and thinking about, wait a minute, what if we really are in an affinity space where we have multiple interest-driven trajectories and people are doing different things towards a similar kind of goal or towards a similar end? So we've been starting to play with theory in that direction, like looking more at connectivity and transliteracies and connections across space and time, and less at the idea of an expertise continuum. So that's been something newer in our theoretical journey.
Before we wrap up, does anyone have anything else that they want to say? Any last comments or things you want to share before we end our broadcast for today? Well, thank you so much. This has just been incredible. I've, as you know, I've been fans of your work for a long time, and it's just been wonderful to be able to talk with all of you and share these ideas with this group. Thanks so much for coming together, for being with us. Thanks everyone who has been in the audience tonight. A special thanks to people who are here at a weird time of day or night.
Yes.
Much appreciated. The video recording of this talk will be up on our website, squip.org, in the next week or so. So we encourage you to use these as a teaching resource for yourself, but share them also with your students and other people in your community. We really hope that these presentations can continue to be useful and that we can all continue to learn from them. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good night or morning.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.